Module 3 of our course, History 380. Now, at this point in the course, as we're approaching midterm here in a couple weeks, things really begin to heat up. And I like this actually metaphorically as well, because sometimes, sometime around your textbook claims about the year 1000 CE, the climate began to warm in an advantageous way, less wet and cold, and a bit drier and warmer, conducive for economic activity. Just think of moving around better for transportation. If the roads, what roads they had back then, were a bit more passable. This allows for all kinds of more economic activity. You got to close your eyes here for a second and imagine, for example, certain tools that began to be using in the Middle Ages, the medieval time, and this kind of 11th and 12th century, this kind of time when things are expanding, such as the use of the windmill, which introduces as well greater efficiency, but also specialization of tool making, because windmills actually take kind of like what we would describe as maintenance men, men and sometimes probably women as well. You can think of the industries today that are creating jobs, such as the solar industry. Windmills were similar. They weren't generating power per se. They were power sources, mostly for mills, for grinding stone. But also metallurgy was expanding at this time. Iron plows were being adapted slowly. And again, think about these iron plows as requiring first the metallurgy to make them, and then the expertise to know how to use them. And they were pulled by 6 or 8 oxen. So you needed larger farms, you needed trained workers or available workers. And this kind of farming really took more of, as your textbook points out, more of a village than just a family. And as the agriculture began to expand, there was more left over at the end of the harvest for people lower down on the ladder. Your textbook asks whether that using the metaphor of a warming climate and things warming up, as I did with the beginning of my presentation, is this a valid metaphor for things getting better? Well, I guess I would suggest that it is one way of thinking of certain improvements. For example, your textbook points out that wine is being produced in southern England. This means that the kinds of wines that were associated with regions in France and southwards towards the Mediterranean now are able to be grown in vineyards much farther north. Again, it encourages population growth, economic activity. And this population growth is going to continue to expand over the next few centuries until the Black Death, which is caused by the bubonic plague, which we'll talk about in next chapter's reading in Module 4, before the Black Death puts an end to that population growth, which had been going on for 700 years in the 11th, 12th, and into the 13th century. This is also the time that the reliance on slave labor begins to lessen. The number of percentages of people enslaved in medieval European societies begins to fall. This is probably due to the fact that, economically speaking, landowners often found it more advantageous to simply have serfs, or to even in some cases to release even their serfs from their fiefdoms, because it was cheaper to have people living on their own small plots of land. So keep this in mind as well. Cheaper to give people small plots of land so they can be somewhat self-sufficient, and you can always hire them in the summer months, spring and summer months, for the planting on piecemeal wages, we might call them, where you get paid for the day, sometimes even in coinage by the end of our period in places like England. England is going to be one of the places where feudalism is going to first begin to decline. And then you have in England the creation of the Domesday Book in 1086. This is an important kind of landmark in history in this region of the world, because it amounted to a record-keeping, largely for tax purposes, so the government knew what was out there. But, as your textbook points out, there were 1,600 watermills or windmills, or watermills. These were mills that were run by the power, by hydropower, by a mill, a wheel powered by fast-moving water. Again, like the windmill, this required a lot of maintenance and skills, and the government wanted to know who had these wealth-producing businesses and tools so they could tax them as well. Other things to keep in mind in this module is the growing of a free farmer warrior class being replaced by land-owning knights. So the knight who owns land is now becoming important. And you can see this in our writing exercise as well when I ask you about the culture of feudalism and the chivalry, the culture of chivalry, the chivalric culture. So free, independent knights are becoming more numerous. Other types of tools that are being invented, or not necessarily invented, but becoming more widespread at this time, would be bells, as churches and even cathedrals are being built. You have foundries being built to create, to smelt the iron to make these large village bells, which would mark special occasions, would mark the time. This also required a lot of specialized labor and knowledge of the process by which you make bells, but how to put them, implement them, how to install them, you might say, because these things weigh sometimes several tons, right? They're not easy things to push around. So all of this is all this economic activity, the windmill building, the wheels that are the hydropower used from the rivers and the streams, the power of the rivers and the streams, even hemp production, which they made rope from, wine production, as I already mentioned, salt. So there are lots of different types of jobs being created, and then probably one of the famous ones, the most important and well-known one, is England's wool production. I say this as well because it's going to be in this important textile industry several hundred, 300 or 400 years later, that the Industrial Revolution will spring from. So the quality of cloth is also improving. England is exporting wool oftentimes to Belgium across the English Channel. This requires that they raise more and more sheep. But they also need to build warehouses to hold the wool. And this is another part of the social history of this time, the growth of the town and the city-states. These city-states and towns, which also contain the local church, or sometimes in the larger towns, in the cathedral towns, cathedrals, these become administrative centers of trade. And in places like Italy, on the Italian peninsula, Italy isn't unified at this time, but you have city-states that actually become very independent, and they're run almost like that fiefdom that is described in Life in a Medieval Baronry, meaning that they're independent and they're very communal. And this is where we also begin to see the difference between the feudal law as represented by the kings in the kingdom, in these larger kingdoms, and town law. That there's a conflict oftentimes between the freedom that people have in these small towns, what there would be small towns by our standards today. Any town, any village over about 400 or 500 people is a fairly sizable town at this time, but there's lots of towns with 1, 2, 5,000, 10,000 people. And those are very important administrative centers, but also centers of these new forms of associations that you hear talked about in your textbook, the association of guilds that grow rapidly at this time because of the economic activity. Each major skilled trade has its representative guild, which can lobby the king. The king recognizes them, and then the king gives these guilds monopolies over that trade. So you'll have guilds like silversmiths, ironsmiths, goldsmiths, all the metallurgy, right? But then you also have millers, those people who grind the grain. You'll have coopers who make barrels. You'll have stonemasons, bricklayers, brickmakers. All this becomes part of the city and the town life. And cities begin, like as I said, in Italy, they become actually independent largely, and there are other independent ones in Central Europe as well, especially in those Germanic states. You'll find some independent city-states. None are as grand, though, we should point out, as Constantinople in the East, otherwise known as Byzantium. The eastern capital of the Roman Empire. Remember at the beginning of the class how I said the Roman Empire really doesn't fall? That's kind of a Western bias because it continues to exist in the East. That continues to be the case. But the other theme of this time period is that Constantinople and the Eastern Orthodox Church there is increasingly going to be in conflict with Rome, and the churches are going to be increasingly separating from each other, going to be a schism between these two churches. But Constantinople, still at this time, is a far grander city than anything you'll find in Europe proper. Byzantium, as modern Turkey is today, Istanbul, the capital, which was once called Constantinople, that city has in its architecture, in its cathedrals, in its sophistication of its scholars that run the church, was far more advanced than anything you would have found in Italy, in Spain, in Europe proper, or the continent of Europe, or in Britain on the island of Great Britain. Speaking of Great Britain, one of the other names you should be familiarizing yourself with this week is Thomas Becket. And this again underlines some of the conflicts between the central power and authority of the papacy, the church in Rome, and the bishops in throughout the papacy, throughout the Catholic Church in these many kingdoms that were uh, ruled over technically by the Pope. But did the Pope, for example, have the right to excommunicate or choose his own clergy underneath the bishop? Or, did he have absolute authority? And this is where Thomas Becket clashed with the Pope, and then he's assassinated, he's killed. It's a magnificent story of Thomas Becket, who's Saint Thomas Becket, some might refer to him as today. And after his death, he was seen to be wearing a hair shirt that was crawling both with lice and with worms. This is one of the things that you have to realize about medieval life. Remember when I was talking last module about the importance of the physicality of life in the medieval world? Well, that just didn't apply to ideas about strength and going berserk on the battlefield and things like that. But it also had to do with religiosity as well and one's devoutness, because they often felt that by inflicting physical punishment on yourself, by wearing a hair shirt, by being kind of physically miserable, that was one way to get closer to God, one way to kind of deny the physical world. The physical world is painful. Let it be painful, and I will turn to godly things, right? So there is that aspect of Christian worship at this time. Then what I also want to emphasize that it's in the church, in the medieval church itself, that you have this growing bureaucracy. And we have lots of these conflicts as well between the popes and the Holy Roman Emperor. The most famous is probably that conflict between Alexander the Third and the Emperor. Alexander excommunicates Emperor Frederick, for example. They end up working out a compromise, and you can read about the kind of drama of this story. But this example of a pope excommunicating the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, who's supposed to be technically, I suppose, under the church's way it was originally envisaged, but the power has a way of grabbing the aspirations of leaders, you might say, right? And absolute power corrupts absolutely. And these emperors felt as though they had absolute power many times and got in clashes with the Pope. Pope Alexander and Fred kind of make up in this way with a compromise over Emperor Fred's daughter, and then him becoming through marriage powerful in the Sicily, in the south of Italy. So be aware of that. Christianization of Europe also expands eastward, and in this way, Kiev becomes the important center of Christianity in Eastern Europe. This is in, of course, modern day Ukraine. The marketplaces and the cathedral there in Kiev are quite impressive. 20,000 population, your textbook says, and it marks an important advancement of Christianity and the pushing back of the non-Christian pagan beliefs in that region. Another area that you should be aware of, you can see on the map in your textbook there in chapter 3 is Novgorod. It becomes an independent city-state itself, a free city, a Russian city, and it was the main sort of link between Kiev and the German tribes farther west. And then you can associate these Eastern centers of Christianity with Byzantium, which developed, or Constantinople, Byzantium or Constantinople, which developed differently, but still Constantinople will be the center point of these Eastern Orthodox religions, as we would call them, today. Other things to be aware of in this chapter are the three crusades that take place at this time, and these crusades lead to migrations of Europeans to the Holy Land. It leads to the stories such as one good story of the kind of chivalric stories of chivalric valor showed in the Crusades. This was the attempt by Western Christian nations and the papacy to retake the Holy Land. The First Crusade was, I guess you might say, somewhat successful in that respect. The second and third Crusades, not so. You have the Song of Roland, which is about the Christian fight against non-Christians, who they called the infidels. The slaying of one's enemy, how this is always a holy act. And, ironically, during one of these crusades, though, the Crusaders themselves end up sacking Constantinople itself. Can you imagine these guys who were supposed to be on their way to the Holy Land? They stop off in Constantinople, but they're not really that friendly. So by the time we get to the Third Crusades, you have other forces uniting the Muslim world. Saladin, for example, uniting Muslim forces and be able to put up more of a unified front against the Crusaders. And in the Third Crusade as well, the Crusaders end up fighting more themselves than anybody else also. So keep that in mind. So the Crusades, the effects of the Crusades towards the end of chapter 3, you can read about that. It increases the circulation of money. It exposes the papacy and lots of the Christian world to non-Christian ideas, to the Mediterranean. The Italian city ports, where a lot of these guys were going into port and exchanging their money and buying things. It's a boom for them in Italy and the Italian ports, which would become so important. We'll read about in upcoming chapter in the Renaissance. So the Crusades are not without their importance, but also it's around this time that you have the first of the pogroms against Jews at this time. So it also seems to breed a certain degree of intolerance for non-Christians. Pogroms are those efforts to expel Jews from certain areas, and it's in the 12th and 13th centuries when you have the first movement of Jews from Western Europe to Eastern Europe, where there are fewer laws and less what we might call today discrimination against them, and simply life was safer. And it's at this time as well that medieval life begins to be centered more and more around the royal court, or at least the growth of these more powerful kings and their courts also comes into existence at this time. Okay, those are some of the terms and theme you should be aware of for this week. Let me know if you have any questions. Jump on the discussion board now and begin to engage with your classmates. I'll see you next week.